Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. It seems like ages since I did a video like this. It's all been about the Monday night live stream in the past 6 months and beyond, which continues, by the way, and the podcast, which I'm putting a huge amount of time and effort into. If you haven't yet checked that out, please do. Pitlane Life Lessons is what it's called. But today I found a few minutes to myself, and so I wanted to give you my reactions to what we've seen over F1 testing, with now just a few days to go until racing starts for real. I want to give you my thoughts on some of the biggest challenges that the teams and the drivers are facing, particularly from a technical perspective, with a brand new set of cars, new regulations, a whole new look to the sport, and the whole new set of challenges that come along with that. Let's start with the way that the cars behave, because we've got a whole new aerodynamic profile with the 2022 cars, and that's creating different characteristics and different behaviours from a driving perspective, many of which we can witness quite easily from the outside. I mean, we can talk about porpoising all day long. In fact, people have been talking about porpoising all day long. Porpoising, this effect or this idea that the car seems like it's bouncing along down the straight as the aerodynamic load builds and then disappears and builds and then disappears. Now I'm going to talk about exactly what that is, why it's happening, and what is the potential solution to it, and why it's unique or specific to these particular cars. And the reality is it's not unique to these cars. There are other types of racing that suffer with this kind of effect. Formula One has suffered with this kind of effect in the past. The idea of porpoising is a term that I'm quite familiar with, but actually, because we haven't seen it in the sport to a great extent for many years, it's a new term to many people. Now, the idea is that because these 2022 cars produce so much of their downforce from the underside and less of the overall downforce compared to last year or previous years from the wings and the bodywork over the top of the car, it's much more sensitive to the car's ride height. Now, if I explain that a bit more, if you think about wings, front and rear wings, if you just take those as a standalone components for generating downforce, and I know that an F1 car is much more complex aerodynamically than that, but the wings create downforce dependent on their shape and their design, obviously, but then that downforce builds as speed increases as the car goes along a straight. Now, what doesn't tend to affect it, significantly is ride height. The wings are not necessarily impacted greatly by the height that the car's sitting at. The airflow over the top is free stream air in the most part, and I'm talking very basically here, free stream air which is uninterrupted by the way that the car is sitting on the racetrack itself. Now, I know it's nuanced, I know there's a lot more complexity than that, but if we keep it basic for now, if we think about the underside of the car and the way downforce is produced with the 2022 cars using these big Venturi tunnels as well as a diffuser, a much greater percentage of the car's overall downforce is now produced underneath. Now, that downforce is hugely dependent on the car's ride height. So as the car squashes down, as it builds up speed running along a straight, for example, as that car starts to squash down, as the aerodynamic load builds, it compresses the suspension, the car begins to sit lower and lower on the floor. As it does that, it generates more and more downforce, because there's a thing called Bernoulli's principle that says that air pressure decreases as speed of that airflow increases. Now, to put that in very simple terms, as we speed up airflow and the air pressure decreases, we create a low pressure zone, and downforce, aerodynamic downforce on a Formula One car in its most basic sense is generated in the most part when there's a low pressure zone sitting beneath a high pressure zone, like on a wing, for example. The underside of a wing creates low pressure because it speeds the airflow up. That airflow, because it's going faster, drops in pressure, and when there's a low pressure zone and a higher pressure zone above it, the higher pressure zone wants to force its way down into the lower pressure zone. It's actually being sucked down to try and fill that low pressure space, and that is what pulls the car down. Now, if you think about, that's the same principle, by the way, that works on wings as it does for the underfloor of the car. Now, if you think about it, when we squeeze airflow through a narrow space, and if you think about that in context of the underside of a car, squeezing it between the racetrack, as that space gets narrower, that airflow speeds up. It speeds up to force its way through that narrow gap. Now, as we know, as that airflow speeds up, it drops in pressure, and therefore we get an even bigger, lower pressure zone underneath the car as the car starts to squash down as it builds speed down a straight. I hope I'm still making sense. I hope you're still with me. The car's continually getting sucked towards the racetrack as the speed increases down the straight. Eventually what happens is that car bottoms out. It touches the ground. And when that happens, there is no more space for the airflow to continue underneath the car. It stalls. There's a blockage. It cannot get through. And in that moment, in that fraction of a second, the car loses almost all of that undercar downforce. Now, of course, when that happens, there's no longer anything to pull the car down to the racetrack as there was before, and it pops back up again. It pops back up to its more regular ride height. Now, of course, what happens there is you've lost all your downforce, the car rises up, but in doing so, the airflow then begins to flow through that gap between the bottom of the car and the racetrack again, and gradually, and this is all happening relatively quickly, of course, by the way, gradually that airflow or that downforce begins to build again, and the same cycle repeats itself. The car gets sucked down until it touches the floor, or until the gap becomes so small that aerodynamically it stalls and the car pops back up. And it's that effect which is sending the car up and down as if it's bouncing along down the straight. Now, you can tell from that the greatest downforce is produced when the car is running at its lowest point before it stalls. Just before the car stalls, that's when the airflow is speeding underneath at its fastest rate. It's got its lowest pressure zone under the car, and therefore it's pulling the car down onto the racetrack in the greatest way possible. And therefore, it's in the team's interests to run that car as low as possible. Now, if you think about the cars of days gone by, where we had these cars with enormous rake angle, very low at the front, but then massively ramped up towards the rear, expanding the diffuser gap. And that was how we generated downforce from the underside of the car, expanding the floor, the gap between the floor and the racetrack, almost as an extension of the diffuser. So having a car really high at the rear actually generated much more downforce. And if you think back to that little trick that Mercedes had on their car last year, where the suspension would collapse going down the straight, it would actually sit much lower. It would flatten out as the car built up speed. Now that was to offload downforce, because sitting a car flat last year would actually minimise the effect of the diffuser ramp and therefore lose some of that downforce and drag down the straight when you didn't want it. Today, the cars are very different, because now we want the car sitting as low as possible to generate downforce. And in an ideal world, going down the straight, you might even want the opposite effect to the one we had on that Mercedes last year, where the car pops up at high speeds down the straight, minimising some of the downforce and that drag that comes along with it. The challenge that the teams have this year is, of course, getting the car to run at its lowest possible ride height to generate that maximum downforce and therefore maximum performance, but without it bottoming out over bumps or over curbs, or as the speed builds to incredible levels, or as the car rolls through corners and it bottoms out on one side because it's running so low, under braking as the car pitches forward, or as it tips backwards through acceleration out of a corner. Ideally, what we want is a really perfectly level aero platform. And that, of course, was why back in the 80s and 90s, active ride heights were developed. Active suspension overcame almost all of these problems instantly. It's a brilliant set of technologies that today would have a really brilliant and amazing effect on these current cars. But of course, it's banned. We can't do that. We can't just revert to that. So the teams have to find ways through a much more simplified mechanical suspension than we've had in the past. None of this clever hydraulic linkages that we might have had and developed in years gone by. We now have a much more simplified system, and therefore it's much harder to control some of these characteristics that the car's now displaying. Now, one saving grace is, if you think about last year, we had the 13-inch rims and the big balloon tyres. That would have been an even bigger problem, because so much of the car's compliance was taken up through the squish of those big balloon-like tyres. The tyre acted like a spring in that it absorbs energy as the car bounces over curbs or over lumps and bumps in the racetrack. But then, of course, it repels that energy like a spring, and we often saw the cars oscillating Well, that bounce, that oscillation of the tyre was beyond the control, in the most part, of the teams. It was just a function of that tyre. Now with a lower profile tyre, at least what we have is much of that car's compliance now under the control of the suspension systems on board through springs and dampers, anti-roll bars, all of the mechanical solutions on a car that can be tweaked, that can be customised, that can be set up to suit the needs of your car with your driver on a particular racetrack. But even so, it's become a huge, huge challenge this year. A new challenge that everybody's going to take time to get used to. And of course, like almost anything in Formula One, that challenge really is finding the right balance between outright performance and the compromise of raising your car to a ride height that minimises the effect of this porpoising characteristic, with the car stalling or bottoming out as it touches the floor going down the racetrack at high speed. The other real challenge that teams are struggling to get to grips with is the overall weight of the car. Having gone up by around 50 kilos, these cars now weigh almost 800 kilograms. That is enormous. That's huge for a Formula One car. I mean, a massive chunk of weight that is now having to be controlled and managed by the teams and drivers. You think about that extra weight that's now wanting to wallow around, wanting to move around and wanting to change the aerodynamic platform of the car as it does so. I get that much of that excess weight comes from the bigger wheels and tyres, which is an unsprung mass, so perhaps not such a big issue in terms of what I'm talking about here. But the chassis are now heavier. Some of the components on the car that are standardised are heavier. There are some safety features on the chassis now which have increased the weight of the cars significantly. And the teams are really struggling to manage that. The drivers especially struggling to manage that around particularly a circuit like Bahrain, which is a heavy braking circuit. It's quite brutal. McLaren are finding out right now just how brutal that is on brakes as they're struggling with cooling. But it's a difficult circuit with lots of slower speed twists and turns and changes of direction that really do put the mechanical suspension components under massive pressure to manage and balance the weight transfer and the movement of the chassis. And bear in mind everything I just talked about in terms of the downforce being produced from underneath of the car with a level platform. You think about that, everything I just said about maximum downforce being produced when the car's sitting at its lowest point just before it stalls. As you go through slower speed corners, the car is sitting up at a much greater ride height because it doesn't have the speed to pull it down to its lowest ideal ride height. So therefore, through the slower corners, you've got much less downforce in comparison to the cars would have had in previous years gone by. That means it's really hard to manage the car through those, and you're relying on much more mechanical grip. You're relying on the tyre grip. You're relying on the suspension to manage those loads through the corners. And it's tough. It's a difficult way of driving the cars. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Cars that are difficult to drive are great. They can make for mistakes happening. They can punish drivers who get them wrong. They can really reward the drivers who manage to get that right. We want to see all of those things. But that's the reason we're seeing so many cars struggling through the tight and twisty bits, locking tyres, getting huge understeer like we've seen in the Mercedes from Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. We have seen the Ferrari seemingly having a pretty good handle on all of that right now. They seem to be one of the best balanced cars right now and relatively quick. The Red Bull, of course, has turned on some pace towards the end of the day and really has shined a light on the fact that they have got performance in that car. But I still don't think we've seen anywhere near the best from Mercedes. But what's great, I think, about the start of this season is that we have an even greater number of unknowns going into the first race. Not just in terms of the pecking order, which is always slightly up in the air off the back of testing because we don't know what anyone's going to be doing or what they've been doing over the course of the test. But we've also got unknowns around reliability. These are brand new cars in so many ways, not just aerodynamically. Lots of new mechanical systems on the car. There's a huge amount that the teams have had to work through. And those teams who've suffered reliability issues throughout the test will have suffered massively in terms of working through their program with all of those things. We also have question marks over some drivers in their new cars. They haven't had much time to get used to those. And if you think back to last year, And that's given a car that was just a mere evolution of many years that had gone before it. We saw some driver moves that took quite a long time to really settle in, to really find their pace, to find their groove with those new cars. I think we've got a brilliant season ahead. By the look of it, the regulations seem to have at least worked some way towards their objectives in terms of allowing other cars to follow, or cars to follow other cars closely behind. Some of the driver comments seem to back that up. And if that's the case, that's great. That could lead to better racing. Let's hope so. So look, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, drop me a thumbs up, a like, and share it around. I'd be really grateful. A quick note, anyone who has followed me for a while knows about my Seedstream app, the Formula One app that me and some friends have been developing over a couple of years now. Well, it's taken some big steps forward for this season, and exciting news is that the Seedstream predictions section, the predictions game, opens up today. You can join, run onto Seedstream, you can find the link in the description of this video, and you can get involved in our little mini predictions league. Just a bit of fun trying to predict the top 5 drivers in the right positions in every Grand Prix this year. There's a new point scoring system this time around, which should make it more competitive, and even if you do miss a race, it's not all over. There's plenty of scope to catch up. So let's get over there, hit your predictions. You can do it up until the race begins next weekend. I'd love to see what you do. If you do it, tag me, share it, let me know on socials. I'd love to hear from you. Have a wonderful week, and it won't be long before we are back watching Grand Prix racing again. I'll see you Monday night for another live stream. Ta-da.